Is this off the record, Daddy-O? Good. In that case, let me sum it up for you real quick. If I answer that question you keep asking, if I give you the name of the big enchilada, you know, then it's Bon Voyage Dino. I mean like permanent. I mean like a bullet in my head, you dig? Does that help you see my problem a little better? You're a mouse fighting a gorilla. Kennedy's as dead as that crab meat. The government's still breathing. You want to line up with a dead man?
You know, either you dance into the grand jury with the real identity of Claire Bertrand, or your fat behind's going to the slammer. Now you dig me?
You're as crazy as your mama. Goes to show it's in the genes. You have any idea what you're getting yourself into, Daddy-O? You think Jack Ruby just up and died of cancer 4 weeks after he gets a retrial? That's some kind of new cancer. I'd say that's a going out of business cancer. You got the right ta-ta, but the wrong ho-ho. The government's gonna jump all over your head, Jimbo, and go cock-a-doodle-doo. Good day to you, sir.
In 1950, America was knee-deep in hearings. Committees dragged mob bosses like Tony Accardo, Carlos Marcello, and the New York Mafia into the spotlight. At the same time, Senator Joe McCarthy was pulling Hollywood names, writers, actors, singers, and anyone connected to Franklin Roosevelt into his circus of communism and suspicion. If there was a whiff of leftist politics or even homosexuality, you were called in. But tables turn. Within a few years, McCarthy himself was under fire. His closest ally, Roy Cohn, was targeted with the same insinuations they once used as weapons. The press whispered. Rivals jeered. The word pansy wasn't muttered, it was shouted in their faces. In Washington, the dirty secret wasn't just corruption. It was hidden lives. Powerful men guarding their double identities. J. Edgar Hoover, the man running the FBI, was one of them. McCarthy himself was another. Roy Cohn, lawyer, fixer, mob mouthpiece, was deep in it. And then there was Louis Rosenstiel, a bootlegger with connections everywhere. Together, men like this formed the backbone of a blackmail machine that never stopped running. Decades later, the operation evolved. Jeffrey Epstein was the next stage. His racket ran out of Manhattan townhouses and Florida mansions. He offered the powerful something they couldn't resist. Young girls, some smuggled from Eastern Europe, others scraped from poor American towns. He made it look like a service, but it was a trap. Once you indulged, you belonged to him. That was the point. Epstein didn't just feed appetites, he created leverage, and leverage is forever. If you think that ended with Epstein's death, you're wrong. The machine kept moving. Blackmail, control, and compromise became part of the system. Ever wonder why politicians get on TV and say things that make no sense to their voters? In 2025, Tucker Carlson sat across from Ted Cruz. Carlson asked him about his loyalties, and Cruz didn't blink. He said he was in office for one purpose, to serve Israel. When pressed, Cruz leaned on religion. It's in the Bible, he said. But when Carlson asked him to point to the scripture, Cruz stalled. He told Tucker to Google it. Right there on YouTube, for everyone to see, the mask slipped. America saw it, and Cruz wasn't alone. Senators, judges, and politicians across the board had sold their votes, some to corporations, others to foreign influence. But money wasn't enough to keep men in line. That's where the blackmail came in. Washington learned long ago. You control a man by what he can't afford to lose, who he sleeps with, what he hides. By the mid-20th century, the Republican Party had been infiltrated from within, not by liberals or radicals, but by closeted homosexuals promoted into high ranks, some of them spearheading Christian Zionist movements. They built platforms, ran organizations, and became the face of family values politics, all while living double lives. In 2025, the cracks showed. During a deposition, right-wing firebrand Laura Loomer went off script. Under oath, she declared that people close to Trump had told her Senator Lindsey Graham was gay. The attorney tried to rein her in, but she didn't care. She said it voluntarily, unprompted, and she doubled down later. Out in the open, it was another thread pulled from a web Washington pretends doesn't exist. Behind the curtain, the rumors never stop. Republican senators living in the closet, lobbyists with secrets buried, operatives using faith as cover. The irony is brutal. The same men who campaign against homosexuality, the same men shouting family values, are the ones hiding it the deepest. Their loyalty to Israel? That's tied up in money, religion, and something darker, racism, mixed with prophecy. The truth is that the white segregationists of the Old South never disappeared. They adapted. They put on suits, took over churches, and reshaped the Bible Belt into their empire. Texas, the Deep South, everywhere their power could spread. They had big money, propaganda, intelligence networks, domestic and foreign. They turned Christianity into a weapon. They trained in the woods for a war they planned to start themselves, a civil war of their own making. Fighting this machine is almost impossible. These men aren't just politicians. They're manufactured. For generations they've been molded, groomed, and pushed into place. And the turning point, the moment it all locked into place, came in 1948, with the birth of Israel. Secret societies in America have one thing in common: bloodlines. Whether buried in small towns across Middle America or sitting in Manhattan penthouses, the families behind them trace their roots back to Europe, often to Britain itself. America wasn't built by nobodies. The first settlers were not ragged dreamers off the boat. They were loyal, elite families, sent overseas after the continent was conquered and claimed. America became their new safe haven. In Europe, secret societies had always been dangerous. The church branded them heretics. The crown called them traitors. If you were poor, that meant torture, exile, or worse. But when the men in question were bankers, scientists, and aristocrats, the rules changed. Their knowledge, mathematics, navigation, architecture, finance, was too valuable to erase. Even Isaac Newton was whispered to be one of them. His discoveries pushed too close to heresy for the church's comfort. Men like him, thinkers, builders, financiers, were among the first to call themselves Freemasons. Masonry wasn't just stonework. It was code, a network of knowledge and power stretching across the empire. Shipbuilding, banking, trade, they financed the future. And when kings and bishops realized these men could be exiled to a new world, the solution was perfect. Send them to America. Get rid of the problem and create an asset. The centuries rolled. Wars, revolutions, America tearing itself from Britain. But even that, some argue, was managed. A staged divorce. Europe's empires bled each other dry, while America grew fat in the shadows. The secret societies financed both sides, waiting for their moment. And when it came, America stepped in, chose the winning side, and crushed the enemy. That's what happened in the First World War, and again in the Second. But by the 1940s, something else was taking root. Christianity itself was being rewritten. Christian Zionists rose, aligning themselves with a century-old movement inside Judaism, Zionism. It wasn't faith anymore. It was politics dressed as prophecy. They stoked the fires that built Hitler's Reich, then pivoted after its collapse. When the Nazis fell, Europe fell with them. Britain weakened. France staggered. The Suez Canal broke the old empires for good. In their place, one empire rose, the American Empire. And at its heart, Christian Zionists were already pulling strings. Their plan wasn't finished. They wanted one more collapse. The final empire to fall would be their own creation, the American Christian Zionist Empire. And they were going to use Christianity itself to do it. In 1948, Israel was born. The Holocaust had shocked the world, and the timing was perfect. American Christian Zionists and Jewish Zionists locked arms. Britain even encouraged Jews to leave England for the new state. America sweetened the deal with something unprecedented: dual citizenship. You could be American and Israeli, both. Nobody asked the public if they agreed. The elite knew the script. They always had. They built the state, they backed the plan, and now they controlled Washington with an iron grip. And in 1950, when they needed someone to guard their secrets, they turned to the man who had been perfecting blackmail his entire life. J. Edgar Hoover. America hated change. Every time it came knocking, the country built a new wall to hold it back. After the First World War, that wall was the Department of Justice. In 1919, the government created an internal spy unit, the Radical Division, to root out troublemakers. At the helm was a 24-year-old lawyer from Washington named John Edgar Hoover. Hoover's first job was simple: hunt radicals. Not spies, not criminals. Radicals. People asking for fair wages, shorter hours, safer jobs. Hoover called them communists. The country called it the Red Scare. His first real assignment was the Palmer raids, mass dragnets that swept up Russians, anarchists, union organizers, anyone who made noise. Hundreds were deported. Many more were beaten and jailed. Hoover, with his bulldog face and tireless grind, proved he could find conspiracy anywhere, real or imagined. He liked what he saw in the mirror. Washington liked it too. By 1920, Hoover was initiated as a Freemason. In 1921, he became deputy head of the Bureau of Investigation. In 1924, Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone named him acting director. A few months later, President Calvin Coolidge made it official. Hoover was 29 years old, running a bureau of 650 employees, 441 of them agents. His first move was telling. He fired every female agent and banned women from the job. The legend began to write itself. The bulldog face plastered on newspapers, the gangbuster chasing Babyface Nelson, John Dillinger, and Ma Barker. The sentinel keeping America safe from Nazis, saboteurs, and spies. The lone man holding back the Red Menace. But the legend was smoke, even then. 3 years after Hoover's death, the smoke cleared. The portrait that emerged wasn't of a fearless cop, but of a bureaucratic genius who cared less about crime than about image. He had a gift for public relations. He inflated his bureau's successes and buried its failures. His anti-communism? Even his aides admitted later he knew the party was never a serious domestic threat. It was just a popular target to guarantee funding and support. In truth, Hoover was less lawman than fixer. He kept presidents fed with gossip, rumors, and secret files. If a president didn't ask, Hoover volunteered the dirt anyway. He tapped phones, spied on cabinet officials, even sifted through gossip about their families. When he found a senator's daughter hooked on drugs, Hoover cut a deal. Keep quiet, and the senator owed him forever. When he learned a congressman was gay, Hoover paid him a visit, promised the story would never leave the FBI, and pocketed another favor. No one understood this game better than Lyndon Johnson. LBJ and Hoover shared a love of intrigue. Johnson constantly leaned on him to spy on staff, political rivals, even fellow Democrats. Hoover delivered. When Johnson's aide Walter Jenkins was caught in a gay scandal during the 1964 election, Hoover went digging for dirt on Barry Goldwater's people, ready to pull the trigger if Goldwater raised it. Goldwater never did. It wasn't just Johnson. Roosevelt started the practice, asking Hoover to wiretap his own advisors, Harry Hopkins and Tommy the Cork Corcoran. Truman dismissed the gossip, calling it garbage. Eisenhower kept Hoover at arm's length, but the Kennedys, Jack and Bobby, were trouble. Bobby treated him with open disdain. When Hoover met him at the Justice Department, Bobby spent the meeting throwing darts at a board. Sometimes he missed and shredded the wall. Hoover thought it was sacrilege. Bobby didn't care. He even had a direct phone line run into Hoover's office, bypassing the secretary who liked to screen calls. For the first time in his career, Hoover couldn't run around the Attorney General. He hated it. Still, most of Washington was terrified of him. Even in death, many refused to talk. His private life was a locked box. The rumors were there, the absence of women, the statues and paintings of nude females in his home, the 44-year companionship with Clyde Tolson. They ate together daily, traveled together, gambled at the track together. Hoover left Tolson most of his estate. Some said it was a love affair. Others insisted Hoover was too scornful of gays to be one himself. Either way, they lived in their own strange world. Tight, insular, and inseparable. The world they ruled was stranger still. Inside the FBI, Hoover was a czar. Agents lived in fear. His rules were endless, his punishments brutal. A man could be demoted, exiled, or fired for anything. An untidy expense account, a wrinkled shirt, a bad haircut. His punishment posts were legendary. Butte, Montana, Oklahoma City, New Orleans. Agents dreaded them. In New Orleans, some of those exiled men fell into the orbit of Carlos Marcello. Hoover hated Marcello, but his disgruntled agents were eating at Marcello's restaurants, gambling in his casinos, taking lines of credit. Marcello took care of their families. When Robert Kennedy pressed Hoover on Marcello, the information flowing back came from agents already compromised. That's how Aaron Cohn, the one incorruptible in Louisiana, earned Hoover's trust, by going after Marcello when others were bought. The Bureau itself became a theater of paranoia. Headquarters was called the seat of government. Inspectors were goons. Violations were subs. Agents spied on each other. Even secretaries were encouraged to inform their bosses. No rule was too small. When Hoover's car got hit making a left turn, new orders went out. No more left turns. When Hoover decided a new recruit was a pinhead, 3 rookies with small hat sizes were fired just to be safe. When Hoover complained about a toilet in his house being too high, a squad of agents worked through the weekend lowering it 2 inches. Yet beneath the pettiness, Hoover did build something real. He took a shabby, corrupt bureau and forged it into a disciplined, efficient machine, terrifying but effective. Former agents admit he gave them pride, but the cost was fear, conformity, and cynicism. And there was always the hypocrisy. He condemned illicit sex, but decorated his home with nudes. He scorned corruption, but pocketed money from books ghostwritten by agents on government time. He built a tax-exempt foundation that funneled awards and cash back to himself. He lived on favors, gifts, and the power of secrets. Even organized crime, the one thing Hoover is remembered for fighting, he avoided for years. Some agents whispered why. Meetings in Central Park with Frank Costello, the Mafia's prime minister. Costello told Hoover there was no Mafia, just loose gangs of hoodlums. Hoover believed him, or pretended to. Others thought Hoover liked the tips Costello gave him on horse racing, his true obsession. What kind of man was Hoover? William Sullivan, one of his top deputies, put it plainly. He was a brilliant con man, a chameleon. He never broadened his mind, never had intellectual friends. He lived in a strange little world with Tolson, but he could fight 33 battles at once without losing track of a single one. Hoover fought for half a century. He outlasted 8 presidents. He became bigger than the Bureau, bigger than the law itself. But the empire he built wasn't about justice. It was about survival. J. Edgar Hoover didn't touch the mob until Robert Kennedy forced him to. It was 1961. Bobby was Attorney General, young, relentless, and already cleaning house. He pushed out CIA kingpin Alan Dulles. He forced Harry Anslinger, the nation's drug czar, into retirement. Then he turned his sights on Roy Cohn, the same Roy Cohn who'd been close to Hoover in the 1950s, the same Cohn who carried the secrets of Louis Rosenstiel, Hoover, and their taste for young boys. Robert knew all of it. He knew about Rosenstiel's parties, Cohn's appetites, and Hoover's vulnerabilities. By going after Roy, Bobby was putting Hoover himself on notice. It was strategy at its sharpest. To get to the deep state, men like Hoover, Dulles, and Anslinger, you had to strike their foundations. Hoover pivoted. He infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan, solved a few murders of civil rights workers in the South, and advertised it as proof of the FBI's value. But when it came to enforcing civil rights law, Hoover was nowhere. He preferred chasing car thieves. Arrest stats were his currency, and in the South, car thieves padded his numbers better than confronting segregation. That's why, when Martin Luther King Jr. called him out, Hoover snapped. He branded King the most notorious liar in the United States, and launched a personal vendetta. The FBI bugged King's hotel rooms, mailed tapes to his wife, even tried to poison his reputation with the Pope. Hoover told aides the problem wasn't that King had affairs, it was that he slept with white women. Sex was never far from Hoover's mind. In 1970, after the National Guard gunned down students at Kent State, top Justice Department officials gathered to discuss a federal investigation. Hoover hijacked the meeting and ranted not about the shootings, but about one of the co-eds being sexually promiscuous. When he was finished, the room emptied in silence. Embarrassment was the only response. Presidents tried to ease him out, but none succeeded. Johnson toyed with the idea in '67. He even sent a Secret Service agent to FBI headquarters to take over. Hoover ignored him until LBJ backed down. Nixon, in 1971, invited Hoover to breakfast, planning to offer him a ceremonial job as consultant. Hoover talked non-stop for 45 minutes, never letting Nixon speak. Nixon lost his nerve. Even the Kennedys, who quietly planned to retire him in 1965 when he hit 70, never pulled the trigger. Hoover held too much dirt on everyone. And he managed the press as carefully as his politicians. The FBI kept its own enemies list of journalists. Jack Nelson of the Los Angeles Times pushed stories on Hoover's abuses. Suddenly his bosses were told he was a drunk, and Hoover gently suggested he be fired. Meanwhile, friendly reporters got hand-fed scoops that made the Bureau look invincible. The truth was uglier. Hoover's FBI harassed Black Panthers, CORE, SDS, socialists, even Quaker pacifists. Informants often stirred more violence than they prevented. The Bureau was an empire of paranoia. Inside headquarters, the seat of government, inspectors were called goons. Agents spied on each other. A slip on an expense report, a wrinkled shirt, a missed weigh-in could mean exile to Butte, Montana, or New Orleans. In Louisiana, Hoover's cast-offs fell into Carlos Marcello's orbit. The mob boss took care of them, fed them credit at his casinos, and welcomed their families to his restaurants. Which meant, when Robert Kennedy pressed Hoover for intelligence on Marcello, the files came from men already compromised. That's how Aaron Cohn, incorruptible and trusted, became Hoover's man in New Orleans, because he went after Marcello when others had been bought. Hoover's world was bizarre. After his limo was hit making a left turn, agents were ordered to map his routes with no lefts. When Hoover complained a toilet in his home was too high, agents measured it, then spent a weekend lowering it 2 inches. If he called a recruit a pinhead, agents rifled lockers, measured hats, and fired 3 men with the smallest sizes, just to be sure. And yet he was untouchable. He built the Bureau into a disciplined, feared machine. He gave agents pride, even as he terrorized them. He broke civil liberties in the name of national security. He lied, spied, and survived 8 presidents. He dined nightly with Clyde Tolson. The two traveled together, gambled together, lived inseparably. Hoover left him most of his estate. Some called it love, others denial, but nobody doubted the bond. Even organized crime, Hoover's supposed enemy, was handled with kid gloves. For years he denied the Mafia existed, parroting Frank Costello, the mob's diplomat, whom Hoover met in Central Park. Costello told him it was just a bunch of independent racketeers. Hoover nodded and maybe picked up a few horse tips from the gambler on the side. William Sullivan, one of Hoover's deputies, put it plain. He was a brilliant con man. He could fight 30 battles at once and never lose track. But he never broadened his mind. He never had intellectual friends. He lived in his own little world. That world lasted almost 50 years. Hoover didn't just build the FBI. He built a fortress of secrets, leverage, and fear. And in the end, the most dangerous criminal he ever protected was himself. Bobby Baker had strong ties to the Louisiana Mafia, which was one of the oldest crime families in America, and by the time most of the country realized it existed, it had already learned its most important lesson. In New York, if you broke the law, you went to jail. Enough crimes, and you ended up in the chair. Sometimes corruption saved the big names, but eventually the spotlight found you. In Louisiana, it worked differently. In 1891, a police chief named David Hennessy was gunned down in New Orleans. The Italians took the blame, specifically the Black Hand. A corrupted judge helped the suspects beat the trial, but the public wasn't having it. They stormed the jailhouse and lynched 11 Italians. That massacre taught the Louisiana outfit a lesson it never forgot: never go public. No headlines, no courtroom dramas. Business would always be behind closed doors, in shadows, or out in the bayou. They buried themselves so deep that when the Mafia became front-page news in New York and Chicago, Louisiana looked clean. By the 1930s, they controlled the state. The Long family's political machine owed them favors. Their godfather, Sam Carolla, was deported in the 1940s. His chosen successor, Carlos Marcello, took the reins. Marcello's wife, Jacqueline Todaro, tied him to another key family, the Todaros, who had served as Carolla's underbosses. Marcello knew how to keep himself protected. If you look at his pictures from that era, you always see 2 people near him: Jacqueline, who was his wife, and his lawyer, Michael Maroon. For heavy firepower, he had Jack Wasserman and Irving Davidson. Everyone in Louisiana politics understood the message: you didn't mess with Marcello. Even mentioning the Mafia in public was bad luck. Memories of 1891 still hung heavy. While New York mobsters like Luciano, Schultz, Lepke, Genovese, Costello, and Adonis were plastered across headlines, Louisiana's outfit thrived in anonymity. The South thought its criminals were outlaws, Bonnie and Clyde, folk villains. They had no idea they were living with one of the oldest Mafia dynasties in America. New York knew. They poured money into Louisiana in the 1930s. Frank Costello once said Louisiana was the best investment I ever made in my life. By the 1940s, the Marcello syndicate was a powerhouse. Siegel's Flamingo in Vegas had Luciano and Costello's blessing. The South built its own gambling empire, laundering more money than New York and Chicago combined. New Orleans became a hub of international crime. French Corsicans, Cubans, the Irish, the Vietnamese, Mexicans, the Black Mafia, New Yorkers, Chicago bosses. Everyone sent representatives to cut deals in the Crescent City. Corruption, drugs, gambling, politics. It was all done there. Texas fell next. The Maceo brothers built Galveston into a money machine, then went legit in Vegas during the 50s. They put up a front family, the Fertittas. Marcello sent the Campisi and Civello families to Dallas to carve up rackets, while Ruby and Chicago's men were sent to back them. By the mid-1950s, New Orleans and Chicago struck a deal. Texas would be shared. Marcello was powerful, but he wasn't a king. No one man in the Mafia ever was. The power came from syndicates, the cooperation of men like Marcello, Trafficante, Gambino, and Costello. Together, they moved billions. But Marcello's real war wasn't in New Orleans. It was in Washington. His enemies were men like John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. And by the late 1960s, all three were dead. Two magazine stories in 1967 pulled Marcello into the public spotlight. One, published September 8th, tied him directly to Jim Garrison, the New Orleans DA who would later become famous in Oliver Stone's JFK. What the public didn't see was that Garrison's so-called investigation into the Kennedy assassination was a fishing expedition, run not against Marcello, but for him. Witnesses who could link David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, or Guy Bannister back to Marcello didn't live long. They were silenced one by one. Garrison got the message. His probe folded. In 1966, Marcello was arrested in New York at La Stella restaurant, sitting with Trafficante, Gambino, Mike Miranda, Tommy Eboli, and Colombo. No more denials. He was part of the Mafia. When he came back to New Orleans, an FBI agent taunted him at the airport. Marcello punched him in the face, twice. He was making headlines now. People weren't whispering about a tomato salesman. They were saying out loud what had been unspoken, that Marcello might have had a hand in killing the president. On September 8th, Life magazine dropped its spotlight on Carlos Marcello, the 5'2" boss of Louisiana, and in doing so pulled the curtain on a national truth. Organized crime wasn't just something that lived in smoky back rooms or behind neon-lit clubs. It was in the bloodstream of American life. The magazine's series made it plain. Every American, knowingly or not, paid tribute to the mob. The housewife who bought a product from a mob-controlled supplier. The kid who dropped a dime into a syndicate jukebox. The small-time gambler who played the numbers. The businessman who took a quick loan from a mob shark. Tribute, one way or another, flowed upward. The scale was staggering. Illegal gambling alone brought the mob $20 billion a year. $7 billion of that was profit. And more than half of it came from sports. Sports betting was the mob's surest racket. Every football game, every basketball matchup, every horse race carried a line set by bookies who needed the latest information. Injuries, locker room fights, fatigue. Sometimes the line was enough. Other times, the games themselves were bent. The FBI's files showed how far the mob's tentacles reached. In Miami, top bookie Gilbert Beckley was caught moving $250,000 in bets in a single day. His ledger linked him to Frank Rosenthal and Eugene Nolan of Baton Rouge. In Beckley's Black Book, agents even found a note tying him to Francesco Skee-Ball Schibelli of Springfield, Massachusetts, a Genovese family lieutenant. Next to it was a name that raised eyebrows. Bob Cousy, the Celtics legend turned Boston College coach. Cousy admitted to life that he knew Schibelli and his partner Andrew Pradella, both gamblers. He had talked basketball with them, even after Boston police warned him off. "I'm cynical," Cousy said. "I think most people who approach me want to use me in some way." Up in New England, the mob operated out of a shabby roadside shop called Arthur's Farm. On the surface, it sold cheap goods. In reality, it was a mob hangout, a market for stolen property, and a betting hub. Patriots quarterback Babe Parilli admitted half his team stopped there on the way home from practice. He insisted they only wanted to buy razors and toys wholesale. The FBI said otherwise. The farm's regulars included bookies Nicholas Ventola and Richard Castucci, and Henry Tamelio, lieutenant to New England boss Raymond Patriarca. This was the new face of organized crime. Not the Tommy gun mobsters of the 30s, but businessmen in suits, backed by accountants and lawyers. They had their boots shined, but the threat of violence was never far away. And then came the pivot south to New Orleans. Here, the mob didn't just lean on athletes or bookmakers. It ran government, business, and the streets. The exemplar was Carlos Marcello. Marcello wasn't folklore. He wasn't a ghost story. He was a working boss who turned the machinery of Louisiana into a racket. His empire stretched from backroom gambling to real estate ventures that drained public funds into his pocket. Where other mobsters skimmed casinos, Marcello created corporations, bought politicians, and made the state itself work for him. In the world life exposed, sports betting was the entry point. But Marcello showed what the game looked like at the top, when the mob's business was no longer in the shadows, but out in the open, dressed up as respectability. Ask for Carlos Marcello in Louisiana, and you'll be marked as an outsider. Ask for the little man, and you'll get a nod, maybe even directions. At 5'2" and barrel-chested, Marcello is short, but never little. His power stretches across the South. Even the bosses back east trust him. In fact, when Jimmy Hoffa's people wanted him sprung from prison, it was Marcello they tapped. They handed him $2 million to fix whatever needed fixing. By then, Marcello was one of Louisiana's richest men. Estimates put his worth north of $40 million. He owned motels, a sightseeing bus company, a jukebox and vending machine outfit, and a 6,500-acre spread in Jefferson Parish. His suits were cut sharp, his cigars imported. When his daughter married, every bridesmaid left in a mink stole. He could write a $100,000 check for hurricane relief, $10,000 for the Girl Scouts, and still be the undisputed lord of Louisiana's underworld. Marcello's domain ran from the Ozarks down to the Mississippi Delta. His power came not from raw muscle, but from the fix. He knew how to buy and bend officials at every level of Louisiana politics. Inside the state, he moved freely. Outside it, he was less sure of himself. In New York, 1966, police raided a mob meeting. Marcello was caught, posted bail, and bolted home. But when he landed in New Orleans, a gauntlet of FBI agents, cops, and reporters was waiting. The little man lost his cool. "I'm the boss around here," he shouted, shoving through the crowd. "There'll be no more of this. Are you looking for trouble?" He swung a roundhouse at the nearest body. Bad luck. It was FBI agent Patrick Collins. By morning, Marcello was charged with assaulting a federal officer. Louisiana's politicians, though, preferred to pretend he didn't exist. "I'm thankful we haven't had any racketeering to speak of in this state," said Governor John McKeithen, calling Marcello nothing more than a thug. Marcello encouraged this fantasy. His name was rarely on the paperwork. His casinos in Jennings, Lafayette, Bossier City, West Baton Rouge, and Morgan City ran wide open, but never under his name. His brothers fronted the businesses. Joe ran the Elmwood Plantation restaurant. Pete owned a strip club, Pasquale ran a bar, Vin handled the jukeboxes, and Sammy booked the bets. Churchill Farms, the $22 million estate, was hidden inside a corporation shared by Carlos, his son, and brother Joe. To outsiders like Aaron Cohn, who came from Chicago in 1953 to run the Metropolitan Crime Commission, the Louisiana system was surreal. "In Chicago," he said, "people were generally on one side of the fence or the other, honest or crooked. In Louisiana, there just isn't any fence." McKeithen ordered the state police to act only when gambling became flagrant or notorious. In other words, when someone complained or the papers got wind. "Look at Grevenberg," he warned, referring to Francis Grevenberg, the ex-state police chief who cracked down with flashlights and raids. "Do you know where he placed when he ran for governor?" Fifth Reform didn't pay. Marcello thrived in that swamp. His record stretched back decades, Assault and robbery in 1930, pardoned in 35. Marijuana dealing in 38, 9 months in Atlanta. Since then, the feds had tried him more than once, but no conviction ever stuck. In Orleans Parish, the law was in the hands of District Attorney Jim Garrison, the same man chasing conspiracy shadows in the Kennedy case. Garrison claimed to have cleaned up the rackets, even as he admitted knowing Marcello's people. Sammy Marcello, Carlos's bookmaker brother. "I've seen him at the athletic club," Garrison shrugged. Mario Marino, a Marcello lieutenant who ran the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. Marino comped Garrison's hotel bills on 3 Vegas trips, signed one tab himself, and even extended $5,000 in casino credit. Garrison insisted it was only so he could cash checks. "I may be naive," he told Life, "but I don't see what's wrong with it." Judge Andrew Bucaro, a municipal court judge, was blunter. He was related to Marcello by marriage, went to parties at Churchill Farms, and didn't deny it. "We don't discuss cases," he said. "We just barbecue goats on a spit. Carlos Marcello needs a fix in municipal court as much as Rockefeller needs to steal pennies. In Jefferson Parish, Marcello's real home base, the protection was even thicker. His town and country motel, his jukebox company, his bookmaking crew, all operated under the blind eye of District Attorney Frank Langridge. Langridge's top investigator, Joseph Zip Cimento, had once been convicted of bribing a witness to help mob bosses beat a case. He also collected for Marcello's jukebox business. Marcello's reach extended far beyond Jefferson. In Bossier City, across from Shreveport, he owned gambling halls, B-girl bars and brothels, staffed by exiles from Phoenix City, Alabama, the town that had been cleaned up in the 1950s. In east-central Louisiana, Marcello used the Ku Klux Klan as enforcers. Near Baton Rouge, his latest project was a new casino disguised as a bingo parlor, run by Frank Vucci, once the personal bookie of Governor Earl Long. Marcello took care of sheriffs. At a peace officers' convention in Bossier City, one sheriff's expenses were covered by Vucci. When the conference ran out of money, Marcello offered to bankroll the whole thing. Another sheriff dined with him at Evangeline Downs racetrack alongside state racing commissioners. Like other mob bosses, Marcello had long since learned the value of legit fronts. His Jefferson Music Company monopolized vending machines and pinball games in Jefferson Parish. He lent tavern owners money on the condition they stocked his machines. His bus firm, Southern Sightseeing Tours, held a near monopoly in New Orleans, and the biggest play on his horizon was the domed stadium for the city's new NFL team, the Saints. Marcello offered 200 acres of Churchill Farms as the site. It looked like civic generosity. But insiders knew the payoff. He expected a $1 million a year parking concession. The little man wasn't little. He was Louisiana's landlord, and whether it was jukeboxes, brothels, or a pro football stadium, the tribute always flowed back to him. As Carlos Marcello's money and influence grew, so did the interest of the feds. They rarely nailed him in court, but they could make him sweat. For years, immigration had been his weak spot. Born in Tunisia in 1910 to Italian parents, Marcello never had a clean claim to citizenship. When Justice Department agents grabbed him off the street in 1961 and dumped him on a plane to Guatemala, it was a reminder. On paper, he didn't belong in the United States at all. Tunisia refused to take responsibility for him. Italy wouldn't either, or Marcello made sure of it. For years, he quietly sent $25,000 annually to a high-ranking Italian official to keep the door shut. The little man had managed the ultimate fix, protection not just from politicians or cops, but from an entire nation. Tracking his business was just as slippery. Cosa Nostra kept no ledgers, filed no reports. Their balance sheet was violence and silence. But when Meyer Lansky, the mob's accountant-in-chief, boasted, "We're bigger than U.S. Steel," federal agents believed him. US Steel was worth $5.6 billion in assets, with annual profits of $249 million. To the feds, Lansky's claim seemed almost modest. The mob had its hooks everywhere, from Wall Street securities to diaper services, from New Jersey garbage routes to casinos in Havana and Vegas. And wherever the mob went legit, the business itself turned crooked. Their executives were extortionists, their salesmen killers. A national food chain learned it the hard way. So did anyone unlucky enough to compete with them. In Yonkers, Genovese capo Nicholas Ratteni controlled 95% of garbage hauling, simply by squeezing rivals out. It looked clean on the books. It wasn't. The real bonanza was the skim. In any cash-heavy business, jukeboxes, vending machines, cigarette routes, box offices, casinos, the mob took its cut off the top before the IRS could touch it. That tax-free cash greased everything. Politicians, cops, hitmen. It even bought off celebrities. One Hollywood actor pocketed $4,000 under the table on top of his $20,000 weekly fee. In Chicago, agents watched Eddie Vogel skim $130,000 from his vending machines in just a few months, counting it with Sam Giancana in the back of the Armory Lounge, among the linens and tomato paste. But the biggest skim of all played out in Las Vegas between 1960 and 1965. 6 casinos, the Fremont, Sands, Flamingo, Horseshoe, Desert Inn, Stardust, bled $12 million a year straight into mob hands. The mechanics were simple, the players anything but. Alexander Gutermer, a Wall Street swindler, owed $70,000 to the Fremont and Desert Inn. He paid up. The money never hit the books. Instead, it moved quietly through Panamanian branches of Swiss banks, courtesy of Eusebio Antonio Morales, Panama's alternate delegate to the UN, later its ambassador to Britain. Vegas was open territory, where all families could operate. Each hidden casino share cost $52,500 and paid out $2,000 a month, 45% annual return. Gerardo Catina's crew in New Jersey pulled $50,000 a month from the Fremont, Sands, Flamingo, and Horseshoe. Lansky and his watchdog partner Vincent Arlo took $80,000. Giancana's cut from the Desert Inn and Stardust ran over $65,000. Cleveland boss John Scalish collected another $52,000 from the same 2 houses. At the center was Meyer Lansky, the mob's cashier and caretaker. Every month, bagmen flew between Las Vegas, Miami, and the Bahamas with satchels of cash. In Miami, Lansky counted it, took his slice, and parceled the rest to couriers bound for Swiss banks or straight to the waiting bosses. The couriers themselves were a gallery of insiders. Benjamin Siegelbaum, Eisenhower pardon in his pocket and political connections in Washington. John Pullman, a Bahamas banker who'd renounced U.S. citizenship and gone Swiss. Sylvan Ferdman, a young Swiss economist, marked a fugitive by U.S. authorities for tampering with the skim probe. Even in Vegas, where the money flowed like water, the tension never eased. How can you steal $100,000 a month and pay dividends? Fremont boss Ed Levinson once asked a partner, "If you steal $50,000, well, maybe." The mobsters laughed at the arithmetic. They weren't in it to balance the books. They were in it to bleed the casinos dry. And, for a few years, they did. Until the feds cracked the system. By 1965, the skim's collapse sent gangsters scrambling to plant their money elsewhere. London, the Caribbean, Latin America, the Middle East. Anywhere cash could move. The mob followed. By 1963, the mob's cash machine had become international. The skim that poured out of Las Vegas casinos didn't just vanish into suitcases. It moved through an elaborate financial circuit. Couriers, bagmen, numbered accounts, and banks with boards full of mob-connected respectables. When Jimmy Hoffa needed money to cover surety bonds for Teamster officials, he cut deals with the same people moving skim across oceans. Sylvain Ferdman, the Swiss economic counselor who built the Atlas Bank in the Bahamas as a satellite of Switzerland's International Credit Bank. The flow usually ran the same route, from the Vegas counting rooms into the hands of couriers like Benjamin Siegelbaum or Ida Devine, the only woman trusted to carry for Lansky. Ida was the wife of Irving Niggy Devine, a Las Vegas racketeer with his fingers in everything. She was also Lansky's backup bagman, the lady in mink. When Siegelbaum was sidelined, she took over. The bags went from Las Vegas to Miami, from Miami to the Bahamas, Bank of World Commerce, Atlas Bank, and then into Switzerland's International Credit Bank. By 1965, all three boards were packed with the mob's friends. The ICB president was Tibor Rosenbaum, traveling on a diplomatic passport from Albania. The board featured Ed Levinson, who ran the Fremont Casino, and John Pullman, the ex-American banker who renounced citizenship and went Swiss. Ferdman himself was on staff. The Bank of World Commerce listed Levinson, Siegelbaum, Pullman, and Niggy Devine. Siegelbaum set the record. For more than 2 years, he shuttled between Las Vegas and Miami 2 or 3 times a month, carrying an average of $100,000 each trip. When he went cold, Lansky put Ida Devine on the route. Her most notorious run was pure theater. She left Las Vegas, went to Los Angeles, then by train, she hated flying, to Chicago, to Hot Springs, Arkansas, back to Chicago, and finally, Miami. All the way she clung to a bag stuffed with $105,650 in skim money. In Chicago, she was met first by Mrs. George Bieber, wife of a gangster lawyer, then on her return by Bieber's law partner, Michael Brodkin, whose client list was stacked with mobsters. In Miami, the money was carved up by Siegelbaum and Pullman. $63,150 for Lansky, $42,500 for Jerry Katina in New Jersey. Eventually, Pullman himself was forced out. Ferdman took over the transcontinental and transatlantic bag routes. His contacts made investigators' jaws drop. Communist Party functionaries in New York, financiers dealing with the Czech UN delegation. Combined with Rosenbaum's ICB ties to Eastern Europe, the pattern suggested something startling. Communist money might be flowing back into America through the mob's skim pipeline. Ferdman's undoing came in March 1965 at Miami Airport. Loading bags into a trunk, he dropped a slip of paper. A parking attendant found it. On International Credit Bank letterhead, it acknowledged a December 28th deposit of $350,000 in American banknotes into account number Maral 2812. John Pullman was listed as witness. Ferdman, ever cautious, had added a note in his own hand. The above is subject to the notes being genuine American banknotes. It was the first hard document tying the mob's skim directly to Swiss accounts. By then, Wall Street itself had become the next target. The mob saw America's stock market boom as ripe ground. Joe Colombo's Brooklyn crew pioneered the racket, stealing securities, moving them overseas, laundering them back for resale. Since 1962, Colombo's gang was linked to 6 Manhattan thefts worth $8 million. One of their boldest moves came May 14, 1965, when they looted safes at the Manhattan Surrogate's office, which held securities of local estates. Officials claimed the loss was undetermined. Investigators later put it at $500,000. Some of the stolen paper turned up in Brussels, where a bank was conned into sending it back into the US for resale. Other bundles surfaced in West Germany, France, and Africa, brokered by an improbable London fixer named Alan Cooper, an ex-GI and ex-bank robber. The real payday came when bankers inside the US played along. Colombo's men posted stolen stocks as collateral, borrowed against them, pushed the cash into loan sharking, repaid the bank quick to avoid interest, then retrieved the stolen securities and used them again at another bank. The cycle could double their money in 2 months. The weak link was the banker, and federal investigators identified at least a dozen in New York who went along, some out of greed, others out of fear or blackmail. Not all mob internationalists stuck to finance. Bayonne. Joe Ziccarelli built his empire out of shipping offices in Manhattan, and his stock in trade was anything that moved: munitions, machine parts, even murder contracts. A friend of Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo, Ziccarelli funneled him over $1 million worth of weapons. He arranged assassinations for cash. In 1952, anti-Trujillo exile Andres Requena was gunned down in Manhattan. Ziccarelli's men pulled the trigger. In 1956, Columbia University professor Jesus de Galindez was kidnapped in New York, flown out of Long Island by American pilot Gerald Murphy, and delivered to the Dominican Republic. Both vanished. The plane, federal investigators later confirmed, had been chartered by Ziccarelli himself. Ziccarelli's reach spread to Venezuela, where he landed a $380,000 contract to supply aircraft parts under dictator Perez Jimenez, netting a $280,000 profit. He even offered to assassinate exiled leader Romulo Betancourt for $600,000. The deal collapsed over haggling. Back home in Bayonne, Joe Z did favors for politicians. In 1962, when a gambler turned up dead in the home of a Hudson County political figure, Ziccarelli's crew hauled the body away, leverage that kept the politician in his pocket. Even the waterfront, supposedly cleaned up after Albert Anastasia's 1957 murder, remained mob turf. His brother, Tony "Tough Tony" Anastasio, once boss of Longshoremen's Local 1814, told a federal official on a drunken Miami flight, "They gave me to Gambino. I got to answer to Carlo." His 14,000 Union men had been folded into Carlo Gambino's empire. After Tony's death in 1963, the Brooklyn piers stayed under Gambino control. Manhattan and New Jersey docks were locked down by Vito Genovese's crew. FBI Director Hoover told Congress the ultimate control of the Port of New York rested with those two families. The new face on the docks was Tony Anastasio's son-in-law, Anthony Scotto, handsome, polished, and eager to deny mob ties. "Between you and me, I know there is a mafia," he once told an interviewer. "But I'm not going to talk about it. I've got to drive home every night." He shrugged off his relationship with Joe Colozzo, Gambino's strongman in the ILA. "He's supposed to be telling me what to do. No one tells me what to do." Still, Scotto was known to go out of his way to help Gambino's people. He even sent one of his aides, Natale Arcamona, to Vietnam to speed unloading of army cargo for Gambino-linked interests. The mob's reach had gone global. Vegas skim in Swiss banks, stolen securities moving through Brussels and London, assassinations ordered from Caribbean dictatorships, ports controlled from Brooklyn to Saigon. From satchels of skim carried by a woman in mink to million-dollar deals made in UN corridors, Cosa Nostra had turned itself into something bigger than anyone imagined, and, as Meyer Lansky had put it, bigger than US Steel. When Carmine Arcamona showed up on the Brooklyn docks, Anthony Scotto gave him a quiet assignment: line up a soft berth for a soldier, an American GI who just happened to be Carlo Gambino's relative. Scotto later brushed it off like it was nothing. "I must have sent dozens of those telegrams for one guy or another," he said. "First I knew he was related to Gambino. My name goes on a lot of things. Sometimes you recommend somebody and regret it later." Scotto was the face of the new International Longshoremen's Association. On paper, he was clean. He lectured at Harvard, shook hands in the White House, and flew to international labor conferences. He even signed on as an officer of the American-Italian Anti-Defamation League, alongside Gambino's son-in-law, Dr. Thomas Sinatra, and Frank Sinatra, no relation. Unlike the old waterfront bosses, Scotto cultivated politicians. He'd make a beeline to Senator Robert F. Kennedy at public events, listed prosecutors as character references, spoke smoothly for the Brooklyn longshoremen. But behind him, the mob's grip never loosened. On the piers, Gambino's go-between, John Colozzo, carried more weight than Scotto himself. Scotto hustled. Colozzo lounged in his office, waited on by barbers and manicurists. Federal eyes were on local 1814, Scotto's own. Investigators followed the money. In 1965, accounting fees paid by the union to Farber and Landis jumped 250%, from $2,000 the year before to $7,000. Scotto said the firm just did more work. But prosecutors saw another picture. The firm was also paying $280 a month for Penthouse K on East 58th Street, a Manhattan apartment occupied by Francine Huff, a fashion model, Scotto's girlfriend, and also friendly with Richard Landis, the accountant, and Louis Pernis, another ILA official. A grand jury dug in. Scotto admitted the three of them used the apartment. "It may have been immoral," he said, "but it wasn't illegal." Huff took the fifth. If union funds had covered that rent, it was a federal crime. Across the Hudson, Jerry Katina ran Port Newark like his own toll booth. Nobody set foot on those docks without his man John Lenardis's say-so. A Manhattan ILA boss, George Barone, tried to get a once-no-permission slip. Katina sent the word back, "Nobody spits in Port Newark unless we say so." Barone apologized and backed off. Katina didn't mind outsiders, as long as he got a taste. Lucchese capo Johnny Dio Diaguardi cut him in on a gambling racket in Emerson, New Jersey, and in return picked up control of a union local. That was the way Katina played, deal by deal, kick by kick. And then came the detergent hustle. Spring 1964. Katina and his brother Gene landed a contract to move an off-brand soap powder through their front, Best Sales Company of Newark. Best Sales salesmen included 600 Genovese associates, plus union reps from the butchers and teamsters. Pressure came fast, union agents nudging store managers, saying Best Sales was run by good people, friends of ours. Boxes went on shelves at 70 cents apiece. But the Katina brothers wanted the big prize. A&P, the biggest supermarket chain in the country. First, A&P tested the product. Then their labs killed it. Too weak. Didn't measure up. Word leaked that A&P also didn't like who was behind it. Gene Katina exploded. "I'll knock A&P's brains out." Within weeks, stores started burning. Yonkers, Peekskill, Manhattan, the Bronx. Firebombs gutted them all. Then it got worse. January 1965, Brooklyn manager James Walsh closed his store, drove off. A tire went flat. He pulled over. A carload of men pulled up. 3 bullets dropped him on the street. 2 weeks later, John Mosner, manager of a Bronx A&P, was shot dead in his own driveway. 2 murders, 5 burned-out stores, and still the company didn't connect it to detergent. The pressure mounted. The butchers rejected contract offers, threatened a strike. The Teamsters backed them up. A&P executives were panicked, stores burning, managers dying, unions ready to shut them down. They begged Washington for help. Informants tied it all together. Detergent, fires, murders. But the government couldn't use those informants in court. Instead, U.S. Attorney Robert Morgenthau dragged Katina into a grand jury. As he walked in, Katina asked an official, "What's this about?" "Marketing procedures," the man said. "Marketing of what?" "Detergent." That one word ended it. The butchers suddenly signed the contract they'd been fighting. The bombs stopped. The murders stopped. Katina told an investigator a few days later, almost whining, "I'm sorry. I'm out of detergent." He walked free. 2 men were dead, 5 supermarkets gone, and the boss suffered nothing worse than embarrassment. His brother Gene died later of natural causes. Jerry Katina, the man who torched stores and buried managers, still walked the streets. It was a perfect lesson in how the mob played the game, the fix and the cover-up. Even President Johnson's own crime commission couldn't tell the whole truth. Professor G. Robert Blakey's 63-page report on organized crime, detailing Chicago corruption, judges on the take, legislators kneecapped by mob influence, was gutted to 4 footnotes. The commission's director, Harvard professor James Vorenberg, swore nothing was cut. Investigators said otherwise. Pressure from Chicago politicians, orders to dampen this and dampen that. The names of Cosa Nostra's high command were scrubbed. The blunt charges about bought cops, fixed trials, legislators on mob strings, gone. The reality remained, though. From Brooklyn to Newark to Chicago, the Mafia's strength lay not just in firebombs or bribes, but in the silence that followed. In the 60s, Jim Garrison made headlines shutting down the strip joints and seedy clubs around Bourbon Street. It looked like a clean-up campaign, but Carlos Marcello was behind it. The closures were for show. Marcello made sure Garrison knew the clubs could reopen later, and once he took office, every one of them did. The rumors about Garrison's ties to the mob grew louder, especially after a strange dinner at La Stella restaurant. Marcello decided it was time to move pieces on the board. He picked his men carefully. Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferry, Guy Bannister. Each had a paper trail to the government. Oswald and Ferry had CIA ties. Bannister was running Cuban exile operations linked to the FBI, the same operations Kennedy had publicly claimed were shut down. Marcello's plan was simple. Use them in the assassination, then expose the connections. The government's fingerprints would be all over it. Garrison's investigation started pulling back the cover story. He was probing the very operations Robert Kennedy had tried to bury. By the early 70s, Marcello was at his peak, his influence reaching politics, law enforcement, and organized crime. Then came February 20th. The phones in Garrison's office lit up like a pinball machine. Calls poured in from New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, Mexico City. A Moscow reporter tried 6 times and never got through. "I dialed 23 times before I even got the switchboard girl," another said. "She put me on hold. That was the last I heard of her." The corridors outside the DA's office were jammed with reporters. A pair from Paris Match, 2 from TASS. Even a man from a radio station in Anna, Illinois. Population 4,000. "Where's Norman Mailer?" one woman asked. "Everyone else is here." What drew them was the news that New Orleans had its own Warren Commission, without Washington. And the man running it was Jim Garrison, the 6'6" jolly green giant, a district attorney with a taste for Ayn Rand, contempt for the establishment, and no patience for being told what to do. When Congressman Gerald Ford suggested he pass evidence to the Attorney General, Garrison snapped, "I'm running this investigation for the President, not the Attorney General. If they want to help me, fine, but I'm not reporting to anyone." The press called it bizarre, but Garrison was serious. "My staff and I solved the assassination weeks ago," he said. "We know the key individuals, the cities involved, how it was done." The timing was right. Confidence in the Warren report was collapsing. A Gallup poll showed only 36% of Americans believed Oswald acted alone. Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment was a bestseller worldwide. The story broke on February 17th, when crime reporter Rosemary James of the New Orleans States item revealed Garrison had already spent $8,000 chasing leads in Florida, Texas, and Washington. Garrison exploded, calling it outrageous and irresponsible. James stood by her work. "I showed him the draft the day before," she said. "He read the lead, threw it back, said, 'No comment.' If he'd asked us to hold it, I think the paper would have." Garrison denied ever seeing it. 2 days later, a familiar name surfaced: David W. Ferry. "You had to see Dave Ferry to believe him," one reporter said. "And once you saw him, you never forgot." Ferry was 48, completely bald, glued on his eyebrows, stuck tufts of hair to his scalp with spirit gum. Nasal voice, no taste for soap, a habit of speaking like a professor. His resume was a mess. Failed priest, failed teacher, airline pilot until Easton fired him for homosexual activity, a psychologist with a mail-order degree, private eye, cancer researcher, amateur hypnotist. He trained anti-Castro Cubans, but sometimes professed admiration for Castro. In his spare time, he tried turning a fuel tank into a submarine. Like most of Dave's projects, a friend said, it didn't work. Ferry had been picked up by the FBI right after Dallas, questioned, and dropped. The FBI squeezed Ferry dry, found nothing, and dumped him, a Washington source said. Now Garrison had him back in the net. "Supposedly I've been pegged as the getaway pilot," Ferry told reporters. He denied everything, denied knowing Oswald, denied any plot, and called the probe an utter waste of time. 4 days later, Ferry was dead. They found him in his filthy apartment at 3330 Louisiana Avenue Parkway. The coroner said natural causes, massive brain hemorrhage. Garrison called it suicide, maybe murder. "Evidence developed by our office," he said, had long confirmed Ferry was involved in events culminating in the assassination of President Kennedy. 2 days later, February 24th, Garrison went public. He had solved the Kennedy murder. "Every individual involved will be arrested," he declared. "The only way they can escape is to kill themselves." That turned the trickle of reporters into a flood. Jets unloaded newsmen by the dozen. New Orleans was a circus, the second Mardi Gras of 1967, built on rumors instead of parades. The American press stayed cautious, treating Garrison as a crank. In Europe, he was a crusader. After the ACLU accused him of prejudicial statements, Garrison clammed up. He had the story in his head, but wasn't giving it away. James Phelan flew in 10 days after it broke. 4 years earlier, he'd covered Garrison's Bourbon Street cleanup with investigator Pershing Gervais, a sharp ex-cop who kept Garrison in line. Back then, Garrison's candor was refreshing. But Gervais was gone now. A local writer warned Phelan, "You'll see a different Garrison. He's lost his best people and surrounded himself with yes-men. There's nobody to stop him now." 4 hours after landing, Phelan picked up his first hot rumor. A man leaned in. "The Post is financing Garrison in exchange for an exclusive on the assassination plot. They're sending a guy down to wrap it all up." "I'm the guy from the Post," Phelan told him, "and your story's bullshit." The man blinked. "Oh." For the next 4 days, Garrison was a ghost. Reporters left notes outside his office that vanished into a pile. In the oyster bars on Iberville, the strip joints on Bourbon Street, the press club, everybody asked the same thing. "Do you think Garrison's got something?" 3 answers. 1. He knew exactly what he was doing. 2. He'd lost his mind. 3. He had scraps, not a conspiracy. "He'll make headlines, then drop it. Ferry's death gave him the perfect out. 2 weeks, this'll be over." They were wrong. March 1st, Garrison arrested Clay Shaw. Shaw was 54, tall, silver-haired, unmarried, a fixture in New Orleans society and former head of the International Trade Mart. Garrison's warrant said Shaw, alias Clay Bertrand, met in September 1963 with Ferry and Oswald in Ferry's apartment, where they agreed to kill Kennedy. A confidential informant, Garrison said, was in the room. His men raided Shaw's home and walked out with 5 whips, chains, a black hood and cape, leather pieces, a gown, and a netted black hat. In a jammed press conference, Shaw denied it all. Calm, steady. "I have not conspired with anyone at any time or any place to murder our late and esteemed president." Asked why Garrison arrested him, he said, "I have no way of knowing." The arrest brought in 2 new characters. Dean Andrews, a pudgy lawyer with a taste for sunglasses and cryptic one-liners. 14 pages of him were in the Warren report. He'd told the commission Oswald had come to him in 1963, looking for help with his Marine discharge, often with gay kids, Mexicanas. He said a man named Clay Bertrand called him to represent homosexual clients. And he said that the day after the assassination, while he was hospitalized with pneumonia, Bertrand phoned to ask if he'd go to Dallas and defend Oswald. He refused, too sick. He described Bertrand to the commission as 5'8", sandy hair. Earlier he told the FBI Bertrand was 6'2", brown hair. Confronted with the discrepancy, Andrews shrugged. "I don't play Boy Scout and measure them." He added that after the assassination he'd spotted Bertrand in a bar. Bertrand ran. "I should have cracked him on the head with a bottle," Andrews said. "But I tried to be a good law-abiding citizen. Biggest mistake of the century." Garrison was convinced Bertrand was Shaw. Andrews hedged. He couldn't say for sure one way or the other. Garrison dragged him before a grand jury. On March 16th, Andrews was indicted for perjury connected to a conspiracy to murder John F. Kennedy. He shrugged it off. "Garrison thinks I have the key to some lock. The fact is, I don't." 9 days before Shaw's preliminary hearing, Phelan finally reconnected with Garrison at the Las Vegas airport. His note had finally made it through the pile in the DA's office, and Garrison called to apologize. "I've got to get away for some rest. Meet me in Vegas. Son, quiet. I'll tell you the whole story." When he stepped off the plane, Garrison looked wrecked, slumped shoulders, tired eyes. "I've been going for months on 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night, 7 days a week," he said. Over 2 days, he and Phelan talked 10 hours. Garrison pieced together fragments, spliced with rants about the Warren report. They sent 100 squirrels out to gather leaves, acorns, sticks. Each dumped it in a box. Then the head squirrels tried to reconstruct the terrain. What it took was imagination. It's like chess. I once played an expert 8 hours to a draw. He said his doubts began months earlier, flying with Senator Russell Long. Long distrusted the official story. Garrison came home, read the critiques, and opened his own probe. "You pluck a thread," he said, "and the whole coat unravels." The thread was Ferry's trip to Houston the day after Kennedy was shot. While the country was glued to their TVs, Ferry drove to Houston through a thunderstorm with 2 companions. He told the FBI he wanted to skate. They confirmed he showed up at a rink and dropped it, but they never asked if he skated. Garrison's team checked. He hadn't. He stood by a wall all afternoon telling people, "I'm Dave Ferry." On that wall was a phone. Garrison said it was a message drop. For whom, he never said. Boiled down, Garrison's version was this: a homosexual conspiracy masterminded by Ferry. Kennedy was everything Ferry wasn't: handsome, virile, successful, and there was the thrill of the perfect crime. Remember Loeb and Leopold? Same thing. Ferry, he claimed, had trained Cubans to kill Castro, then pointed them at Kennedy. Oswald and Ruby were both homosexuals, both in the plot. Ruby, nicknamed Pinky, killed Oswald to silence him. Garrison hinted at 2 more gunmen, dropped 2 Cuban names, later flipped one into a cooperative witness. His star witness would be Perry Russo, a 25-year-old insurance salesman. He gave Phelan Russo's first interview. and a hypnosis transcript meant to refresh his memory. They didn't match. One had no mention of a plot. March 14th, Shaw's hearing opened under tight security. Russo testified that he'd first met Ferry in 1962, tried to pull a friend away from his influence. Ferry once threatened to kill him, later became his friend. Russo said he knew Oswald as Leon Oswald, Ferry's roommate. He saw him polishing a rifle in summer 1963. He placed Shaw, Ferry, and Oswald together at a party in September 1963, where they openly discussed killing Kennedy. Diversionary shots. A scapegoat. An escape to Cuba or Brazil. He insisted he was just a witness. He hadn't come forward earlier because he trusted the FBI and was busy with school. Coroner Nicholas Chetter said he'd injected Russo with sodium pentothal. Dr. Esmond Fatter said he'd hypnotized him 3 times. Both said it sharpened memory. Another witness, a heroin addict, swore he saw Shaw and Oswald together. After 4 days, the judges ruled probable cause. Shaw would stand trial. But Garrison's own files contradicted Russo's courtroom tale. His first interview, 3,500 words, made no mention of a plot, a party, or Bertrand. When shown Shaw's photo, he said nothing about knowing him. The assassination story surfaced only under hypnosis. Fatter led him. Picture Ferry's apartment. Bertrand, Ferry, Oswald are there. They're talking about assassinating somebody. Look at it and describe it. Under prodding, Russo finally gave the story. Before the hearing, Fatter even planted a suggestion. Russo would feel calm, confident, his memory sharper, and it will be only the truth. And in court, Russo delivered. Smooth, detailed, believable. After the ruling, Phelan called Garrison. "Something bothers me," he said. "Siambra's first report. There's nothing in it about a party, a plot, or Bertrand." Garrison sounded surprised. "I'll get it out here and have a look." Later, in Garrison's study, Phelan pressed Siambra directly. Garrison was there, Siambra, investigator William Gurvich, and Phelan. Why had his first report on Russo never mentioned a plot? "I didn't know what I was talking about," Siambra said. Then, maybe he forgot to put it in. He admitted he was awfully busy and might have forgotten. He'd even burned his original notes. Phelan asked Dr. Fatter where he got the information he used to lead Russo under hypnosis. "From Garrison's office," Fatter answered. Then there was Sandra Moffat, the woman Russo said was with him at the party. She was found. She denied being there. Denied even knowing Ferry before 1965. With hypnosis involved, Phelan concluded, Russo may not have known what fact was and what hallucination was. At that point, Shaw's trial hadn't been set. It was at least 6 months away, more time for Garrison to solve the case he had declared solved months earlier. When Phelan last saw him in Las Vegas, Garrison left him with one line. It summed up the evidence, the contradictions, the confidence. Straight out of Alice in Wonderland. By 1970, Life magazine went further. They exposed mob money, pension fund scams, the Vegas skim. Their reporters, many of them ex-FBI agents who walked out in disgust, started leaking stories that embarrassed the establishment. One target was clear. Carlos Marcello, the man even Hoover feared. Marcello laughed when he saw the posters for Oliver Stone's JFK in 1991. He'd lived free in the South, untouched for decades. He knew the movie was a diversion. The truth, that he had gotten away with clipping his greatest enemies, was never going to come out. He had beaten the government, the Kennedys, and the FBI. He'd even beat history itself. What happens when law enforcement can't touch you? When Washington can't lay a hand on you? When you assassinate a president and nothing happens? That was the world Marcello lived in. By the late 60s, Senate committees were saying out loud that organized crime was an invisible government. But laws passed on paper meant nothing. Marcello and his allies kept operating. The FBI knew. Some agents tried to stop him, others looked the other way. And Hoover, the man who built the bureau, was already compromised. Marcello had survived them all. That was the power of the Louisiana Mafia. It stayed quiet, stayed in the shadows, and outlasted everyone. In September 1967, after Life magazine ran 3 explosive articles laying out the mob's grip on Louisiana politics and business, Governor John McKeithen packed up a delegation of the state's most respectable names and flew to New York. He sat with Life's editors, trying to spin the damage. Back home, he went on television and repeated his pitch. "Gentlemen, you didn't smear us nearly as bad as you could have. You've been kind. You've given us enough evidence to clean up our state, maybe put people in the penitentiary. We can't wait to get started." McKeithen promised reform. He even invited Life back when Louisiana was looking better. Then he ordered investigations that stretched through his re-election campaign in '68. By the time the dust settled, little had changed. 2 years later, Life looked again. What they saw was worse. In 1967, the magazine had named Carlos Marcello, the 5'1" little man, as the example of how organized crime could control an entire state. Marcello was 60 now, richer than ever, his power unchallenged. He wasn't paying taxes, but he had figured out how to use public money to turn a $1 million swamp into a $60 million real estate score. The state's top officials he dealt with were still on the payroll. Some had been promoted. Marcello still handled rivals the old way. In 1967, Harry Bennett, one of his gamblers, offered to testify to a federal prosecutor. 13 hours later, Bennett was dead. 2 years after that, Donald Jimmy James, a casino man who crossed Marcello on a $10,000 swindle, was found shot in the same spot. Fear was part of Marcello's empire, but protection was the other half. Louisiana politics was lined with men willing to trade favors, careers built and padded through their proximity to the boss. At first, McKeithen put his attorney Camille Gravel in charge of an anti-mob commission. But when Gravel aimed at Sammy Downs, Marcello's friend and McKeithen's most powerful lieutenant, the investigation stopped cold. Gravel quit in disgust. Downs, meanwhile, was bouncing between jobs, working for George Wallace's presidential run while keeping his Capitol suite, then returning to Baton Rouge as McKeithen's executive counsel. The governor even put him in charge of the state's public works department. The probes that followed were theater. District Attorney Sergeant Pitcher, with jurisdiction over the Capitol, ran an 8-month inquiry. His verdict: no ties between Marcello and Baton Rouge. A state ethics commission looked into Marcello's cozy relationship with state police Captain Roland Coppola. Coppola had solicited $42,000 in loans from the boss, and gambling thrived in his parish. The commission called it nothing serious. He got a 30-day suspension for accepting gratuities. The real perk, oil royalties worth $30,000. Coppola kept his job, even moved into headquarters. Attorney General Jack Gramillion was handed special funds to investigate organized crime. He found nothing. He was too busy cleaning up his own mess. In 1966, Gramillion and Associates launched Louisiana Loan and Thrift. Over 21 months, it vacuumed $2.6 million from small depositors and funneled it into loans for politicians and Marcello-connected businesses. The company collapsed in '68, federal auditors moved in, and Gramillion was caught holding $10,000 in fees and $200,000 in loans. He was indicted. The depositors were still waiting for their money. In New Orleans, D.A. Jim Garrison, who made his name chasing Kennedy assassination theories, ran a string of grand juries that all came back with the same line: no organized crime in Orleans Parish. Meanwhile, outside agencies were busting major layoff bookmakers right under his nose. Sam DiPiazza and Eugene Nolan were convicted. Frank Timpany awaited trial. Evidence showed they were handling hundreds of millions in bets from New Orleans. Garrison ignored it. From 1965 to 1969, he secured only 7 convictions or pleas against Marcello's crew, while dropping 84 cases. Gambling, attempted murder, kidnapping, manslaughter. When one of Marcello's bagmen, Vic Corona, collapsed from a heart attack in Garrison's own home during a political meeting, the DA managed to keep it quiet. In Jefferson Parish, right next door, DA Frank Langridge played the same game. He declared his district clean while sharing staff with Marcello. His investigator, Joseph Zip Cimento, doubled as a mob collector. The list of officials tied to Marcello was long. Tom Ashey, a bookie, sat on the State Racing Commission. Marshall Brown, the Democratic National Committeeman, made calls from Marcello's phones and handled McKeithen's New Orleans patronage. Leon Gary, director of the State Highway Commission, arranged Las Vegas accommodations for legislators through Marcello's man out west, Mario Marino. Former Governor Jimmy Davis, who had long helped Marcello, was gearing up for another run in 1972, when McKeithen would be barred from running. And then there was Frank Ticky Sire, a Baton Rouge contractor, political insider, and sports figure. In September 1969, police raided a Houston gambling operation. They arrested Sire and Marcello's man, Frank Caracci. Sire wasn't just another name. He sat on the state licensing board for contractors, had been a regional advisor for the SBA, and was a close friend of both Governor McKeithen and Senator Russell Long. Just a year earlier, he had been named Louisiana's outstanding small businessman. Phone records from the Houston raid told the story. On one side, calls to gamblers and mob figures across the country. On the other, calls to Louisiana's political elite, Governor Davis, Marshall Brown, AFL-CIO President Victor Bussey, School Superintendent Bill Dodd, Racing Commission Chairman L.A. Holland, Highway Director Gary, Senator Long, D.A. Pitcher, Federal Judge Gordon West, Sheriff Brian Clemens. A high-ranking state police officer rushed to bail Sire and Caracci out. The case was dismissed on a bad warrant, but Marcello was rattled enough to shut down his entire gambling network until he could rebuild it with new codes and a fresh phone system. To Louisiana politicians, Sire's ties to both Long and Marcello weren't scandal. They were business. 2 generations of the Long dynasty had worked with the mob. Huey Long himself had once invited New York boss Frank Costello into Louisiana to set up gambling. Costello later called it the most profitable investment he ever made. Carlos Marcello grew out of that soil. Earl Long courted him. Russell Long took his money. By 1951, Kefauver's crime committee identified Marcello as a heavy contributor to Russell's campaigns. Marcello's reach extended deep into the state revenue department, the office responsible for taxes. Insiders admitted he could arrange hires, audits, and settlements at will. For businessmen in trouble, the surest fix was to go through the little man. The cost? Millions lost by the state every year, more than $100 million by some estimates. One example stood out. A $32 million tax claim against a major national corporation expired untouched on the desk of Revenue Attorney Emmett Batson. Batson himself hadn't filed his own taxes since 1965, and he pocketed $28,000 in outside fees. Louisiana hadn't prosecuted a single case of income tax evasion since 1942. Carlos Marcello didn't just own a piece of Louisiana. By 1969, he was Louisiana. The politicians worked for him, the cops looked away, and those who didn't? They wound up like Bennett and James, dead in the same spot, reminders of who really ran the state. When life pressed the Revenue Department about its inaction, Ashton Mouton, the man in charge, didn't blink. "I'm no Simon Legree," he said. "There's lots of people who don't file, but we don't prosecute because it just puts them out of business." Mouton left Marcello and his circle untouched. Instead of discipline, the department promoted Emmett Batson, the same attorney who hadn't filed his own returns in years, to chief counsel. His predecessor, John Levy, had literally kept Marcello's tax files in a drawer marked Hold Action. The drawer is gone now, but what it contained tells the story. Carlos and his brother Anthony owed $40,000 in state taxes for 1962. No records exist for later years. Joe Marcello and Roy Occhipinti, another partner, were allowed to file late returns for the Desta Mortgage Company, but weren't forced to pay what was owed. Occhipinti was delinquent on his own 1963 taxes and hadn't filed since '65. In 1965, a state investigator recommended prosecuting Mike Maroon, attorney and operator of Marcello's Town and Country Motel in Shreveport. 2 years later, the file was closed, per instruction of Mr. Mouton. Joe Marcello, who ran the family's profitable Elmwood Plantation restaurant, hadn't filed in 8 years. A planned inquiry into Elmwood's tax irregularities was also killed by Mouton. Even Marcello's friends got special treatment. Marshall Brown, the Democratic committeeman, McKeithen ally, and frequent caller from Marcello's phones, had a fat, confidential file of tax claims marked Special Handling. It was the same story across Marcello-linked corporations, CBM, LaRue 90, Garnet Land, Sapphire Land, Stevie Corporation, and a dozen others. One disheartened investigator left a note in File 74,338. "I have my doubts this claim will be paid. Of course, these doubts are based on numerous other claims that I have had experience as belonging to Carlos Marcello, his associates, or affiliated corporations." In January 1969, Division Director Millard Bird tried to change course, ordering collection on all Marcello back taxes dating to 1960. Chief Counsel Levy shelved the files. 2 months later, Bird was retired early. While the state looked away, Louisiana bled. Budget cuts gutted social services. Schools lost funding. Welfare for a family of 4 dropped from $108 a month to $85. Charity Hospital in New Orleans, the biggest in the South, was turning away patients for lack of nurses. McKeithen blamed the legislature for blocking tax hikes. The legislature blamed his administration for inefficiency. But neither had an answer for why the state wouldn't collect from the one man who owed the most. And tax evasion was only the beginning. The masterpiece of Marcello's career wasn't a shakedown or a casino. It was Churchill Farms. In 1959, Marcello bought 6,000 swampy acres in Jefferson Parish for about $1 million. On paper, it was worthless. Just a hunting lodge, a caretaker's shack, and marshland. But drained and diked, appraisers said, the land could be worth $60 million. Marcello didn't pay to drain it himself. He created his own taxing district and had Louisiana taxpayers foot the bill. With parish and state approval, Churchill Farms became its own drainage district. The public picked up the costs, Marcello kept the profits. In 1964, outgoing Governor Jimmy Davis signed a contract obligating the state and the Lafourche Levee Board to spend $1 million building a levee around Churchill Farms. The levee protected only his swamp, no one else's land. On top of that, Davis's contract paid Churchill Farms $500,000, half of Marcello's original purchase price, as compensation for using his land. McKeithen, claiming his hands were tied by Davis's deal, authorized the check in 1967. He admitted the project didn't benefit anyone but Carlos Marcello. The levee went up in '68. Giant pumps were installed to dry out the swamp at a cost of $1.5 million. Another $2 million in bonds was lined up for more drainage. Roads and state highways were mapped to crisscross the property, making it prime real estate. Marcello himself bragged in a 1968 federal tax hearing about how he negotiated directly with the Davis administration and the levee board. He predicted $1 million pumping station, new highways, and massive public investment. He was right. The Dixie Freeway was routed through Churchill Farms. The pumping station was built. On parish tax rolls, Marcello's 6,000 acres were valued at just $22,000. His yearly school tax bill was $594. All told, Churchill Farms paid $2,030 a year in taxes for hospitals, schools, roads, drainage, and sanitation combined. Even if assessed at his 1959 purchase price, he should have been paying 5 times that. In reality, the property was worth 60 times more, and the perks kept coming. The gravel road and private bridge to Marcello's hunting lodge were maintained at parish expense. A road grader was parked inside the compound for his personal use. The contrast with the parish school system was brutal. Jefferson Parish schools were on the edge of collapse. Deficits from 68 and 69 totaled $3.5 million, roughly the same amount taxpayers had already spent improving Marcello's swamp. Some excused McKeithen, arguing Louisiana was never a reform state. It had joined the Union without ever knowing self-government. 95 years earlier, Sicilian immigrants had planted the first Mafia family in the Western Hemisphere on Louisiana soil. Marcello was their heir. To be fair, life found no evidence McKeithen himself was dirty, but his record was clear. He had vowed to rid Louisiana of Marcello, launched headline investigations, got himself re-elected, and stopped there. At the governor's mansion in Baton Rouge, the reception room floor is covered by an ornate rug. The state's emblems and mottos are woven into the design. In each corner, the word confidence is embroidered on the border. But the rug was made in Hong Kong. When it arrived, the word was stitched backwards. For weeks, no one noticed. It was a fitting symbol. In Louisiana, even the confidence was counterfeit. For all the rackets Carlos Marcello ever ran, gambling, loan sharking, protection, the crown jewel of his career wasn't an underworld hustle. It was Churchill Farms. 6,000 acres of swamp, once good for mullet, catfish, and weekend duck hunts, were now being reborn as prime real estate, courtesy of the taxpayers. While Marcello lounged at a Gulf Coast motel, a $1 million pumping station, built with public funds, was draining his land. Soon, it would be worth 60 times what he paid for it. But even as the swamp dried, 2 storms gathered over Marcello's head: the federal government and the Mafia itself. The feds moved first. In 1966, Justice Department raids hit gambling warehouses across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Oklahoma, operations long under Marcello's protection. His enemies in the national mob hierarchy, led by Santo Trafficante of Tampa, seized on the raids as proof Marcello had lost his grip. They pressed for his removal. That September, Marcello was summoned to a secret Mafia tribunal in Queens, the so-called Little Appalachian meeting at La Stella restaurant. Present were Trafficante, Marcello, and the judge himself, Carlo Gambino, the Cosa Nostra commissioner. The police raided before dessert. All 3 men were arrested. Marcello, though, had already won his case. Released from custody, he landed back in New Orleans in high spirits. At the airport, he faced reporters and FBI men with a declaration, "I am the boss here." Then he punctuated the point with a roundhouse right to the jaw of FBI agent Patrick Collins. The punch cost him. Convicted of assaulting a federal agent, Marcello drew a 2-year sentence. He appealed and remained free, but the pending prison term gave Trafficante fresh ammunition to push for a successor. That brought the family problem into the open. Who would inherit Louisiana? Marcello himself had taken the crown from Silvestro Silver Sam Carollo, the feared boss of the Huey Long era. Deported to Sicily in 1951, Silver Sam was now 74. Sick, but still a name to reckon with. His son, Anthony Carollo, a moneylender and restaurateur in New Orleans, wanted the throne back. He had Trafficante's backing. Marcello naturally wanted the seat to stay in the family, lined up for his younger brother Joe. The dispute escalated. Last summer, Anthony Carollo and his sister Sarah Misakura flew suddenly to Sicily to consult their father. Silver Sam agreed to return and mediate. By October, he was in Windsor, Ontario, just across from Detroit. By the new year, he had quietly slipped back into New Orleans. Nobody noticed until February, when TV newsman Bill Elder found him in a New Orleans hospital's maximum care unit, recovering from a heart attack. That discovery forced federal hands. Gerald Gallinghouse, the new U.S. attorney in New Orleans, brought Carollo's case before a grand jury. Silver Sam was indicted for illegal re-entry. He recovered enough to leave the hospital and move in with his daughter, while Gallinghouse pressed immigration to explain how Carollo had slipped back so easily. The probe widened, because Carollo wasn't the only ghost on American soil. Carlos Marcello himself had been deported in 1961. A month later, he returned, quiet as a shadow, and had lived openly in Louisiana ever since. He shook hands with politicians, dined with judges, and drained his swamp into millions, all while technically an illegal alien. Louisiana looked the other way. Washington had begun to notice, and in the Mafia's back rooms, the knives were being sharpened.